I thought we could go back to the beginning. Tell us a little bit about July the 12th, 1995, which I understand was a life-changing day for Chicago, but also for you.
Well, it was. I grew up in Chicago, so it's a city I care about quite a lot. As it happens, I was in Paris on July 12th, 1995, but I was reading the newspaper and I came across a story about the city of my birth, Chicago. And there was a terrible heat wave there, the kind of heat wave you're familiar with in Australia these days. Temperatures, in our language, 106 degrees. I have no idea what that is in Celsius, but up in the
Hot,
40s,
hot.
and a lot of humidity. The city was baking, and the city did what it always does when it's very hot. It jammed on air conditioning, so everybody turned on the air conditioning, and then the power went out, and then you really got a sense of conditions without a kind of artificial assistance from this life-saving technology. People were on their own. And I started looking at the patterns of, what happened in Chicago that week. It was a week-long heat wave, and I got very concerned. More than 700 people died. And I decided that I wanted to do some research into which neighborhoods were most affected, which places had the highest death rates, the most illness, which places had the most resilience. And when I first looked at the map, it was pretty much as you would predict. The poorest neighborhoods, the most segregated neighborhoods, the places that are always in the news for having trouble, had the most trouble. They had the most deaths. And it looked like it was a very straightforward story about race and poverty and American inequality. And it was. But it turned out it was much more interesting than that, because when I looked even closer, I discovered these patterns that no one had seen. So I think what's most interesting for our conversation today is that there were these pairs of neighborhoods around Chicago where you had two communities, same racial demographics, same poverty level, same level of older people living alone. They looked statistically like they were basically identical, but one side of the street, one neighborhood, highest death rate in Chicago, other side of the street, different neighborhood, one of the safest places in Chicago. So I saw these patterns occur, and I realized there must be something that's driving people's experience, their vulnerability or their resilience, that goes beyond the ordinary factors. And I started to explore the neighborhoods. And here's what I discovered. I discovered that the factor that really distinguished a safer place from an unhealthy place is this thing I call social infrastructure. And when I say social infrastructure, I mean the physical places that shape our capacity to interact with each other. So the neighborhoods that had high death rates, they looked bombed out. They had a lot of empty lots. They had abandoned buildings. They didn't have little cafes and grocery stores. They didn't have local libraries or community parks where people felt safe. And as a consequence, people who lived in those neighborhoods, they tended to hunker down at home. They lived on their own. They found a way to do things, and maybe they went to socialize. They got in their car and drove other places to socialize, but they didn't turn the neighborhood into their living room. On the contrary, the places that were the safest in Chicago, the places that, despite the fact that they were poor and racially segregated and vulnerable in 1,000 ways, people survived among the highest rates in Chicago. What those places had is this booming social infrastructure. People sat on their stoops, the stairs outside of their apartment buildings. They had little pocket parks that were attractive. They had commercial outlets where people could go to gather together. They had local libraries and community institutions. And so what happened is that people in those neighborhoods developed routines of just being out in public. And what that meant is, if you were vulnerable that week, if you were old and frail, at risk of dying in your apartment, if someone knows that you're always sitting on a park bench at 4 o'clock every Tuesday and you're not there, they come and knock on your door. And so it's the knock on the door that saves a life in an event like that. But to get to that knock on the door, you need a social infrastructure that supports life on a daily basis. When I finished that project, Chemène, I learned something amazing, which is that it wasn't just that the rich social infrastructure neighborhoods had higher resilience during the heat wave. Their life expectancy in ordinary times was 5 years longer than the life expectancy of the neighborhoods across the street. It was a stunning finding for me, and it really spoke to the importance of social infrastructure in our daily lives.
That makes so much sense. I know reading in the book, and I should just do a little plug for your book, I think, because we are speaking about your book from 2018, Palaces for the People. And you mentioned those two, Auburn Gresham and Inglewood were the two neighborhoods that you were particularly speaking about. And your stats, you said that Inglewood had 10 times more deaths than Auburn Gresham did, despite them being, as you say, so much the same. So you started mentioning about this need for gatherings and collecting and civic and collective life. And we are all, of course, working with community colleges here in Australia. So we're thinking of educational institutions. And you mentioned quite a few examples of education institutions that both seem to work with social gatherings and not. I was especially interested in your own children's school in Manhattan when they were young. And what I liked about that story was that it seemed a fairly small school, but it made very good use of the space around it. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Well, I actually drew a contrast between two experiences I had with my kids.
Mm.
We live in Manhattan most of the time. We spent a year in Palo Alto, California, and my kids went to a suburban school in a town called Menlo Park. And it was a beautiful campus, actually. They had lots of great outdoor space and a big garden, and it looked like a lovely place. But a really interesting feature of that school is that the parents dropped their kids off with a car because it's a big suburb and people drove everywhere. And they had this, incredibly efficient line where you would drive through the driveway and drop off pop into a space and drop off your kids, and a person would pull your kid out. And it was incredibly efficient and horrible for social life because you basically sat in your car and your kid jumped out, and then you drove on to your office where you spent the day sitting in front of your computer. The contrast with that was this school my kids went in Manhattan, where every day, families walk their kid to school. You'd bump into families on the walk there. Then the school required that parents come into the classroom with their youngest kids for the first 10, 15 minutes every day. So you've got these really crowded rooms with lots of parents and kids together. And it would have been horrible during the peak of COVID. But in ordinary times, it was great. You wound up bumping into and talking with parents in a regular way, right? Day after day, month after month. And then after that, social life would kind of spill out into the plaza outside of the school in this very crowded Manhattan neighborhood. There were lots of coffee shops around. Generally speaking, the parents would go peel off and have a drink together and then go to work. It was a completely different kind of experience. And that had to do with, the way that the design of the school worked, but it also had to do with the programming, right? The way that we organize social interaction. And in my work, I try to encourage everyone who's running an institution or a local government or a corporation, to think about the way in which the physical layout of the place where people go every day encourages or discourages interaction, and also the ways in which we could program activities to make being with each other a little bit easier, because social infrastructure develops social capital when people have recurrent interactions in a physical space, right? If there's a place where you go once and you bump into someone like a farmer's market and you don't see them again, you might not develop a relationship there. But if you go to the same farmer's market every week and there's a group of people who go to the same vegetables produce shop or fishery, you start to talk a little bit more. So we can always think about how to program more effectively. And I think that's just vital for this conversation.
And that's why I really love the two contrasting examples of your kids' schools. As a teacher who used to work at one of those places where you have the drive away, the pickup and the take home drop off, I know exactly what you mean. But what I really liked thinking about our audience is that we don't necessarily have capacity to start rebuilding new things, and I like the story of your Manhattan school, that it was making use of things that were around. It was making creative use of the physical infrastructure, but then layering, as you said, the right programming onto it. And I think that sort of idea can give a lot of food for thought to some of the community colleges here. So look, it's a short conversation today, but already I think you've piqued our interest and you've gotten us thinking about, the wonderful thing, unique thing about community community colleges here in Australia is that we are small. I know there was some interesting stories in your book about reducing the size of some of the educational institutions and what a wonderful difference that made as well. But also, community colleges they don't just serve the community, they sit in the middle of the community. So I think this has given us some wonderful starting points for some conversations over the rest of our conference that we have ahead of us, to think about some ideas for making use of the physical infrastructure that's there, and to put some creative programming in place, and to consider what we can do to do not just provide education, but to provide all those community supports that we have been dealing with. Many of our colleges have dealt with the floods, the fire, you name it. They've all been an important part of dealing with that. So my final question to you is really just an open one. It's that throwaway one that everybody asks when at the very end. What else can you say to us, or can you offer, or anything that you think might be of use to a community college culture who really does have their heart in the right place? They want to help.
Well, I'll just say that, everyone in community college should recognize that the social infrastructure is just as real and consequential as all the other infrastructure that makes a community college function. So if I told you that there's no electricity at the community college, it would be clear that you would need to really work on that problem, right? If the plumbing was broken in the community college and the bathrooms didn't work, that would be a crisis and you'd have to deal with it. If the internet was down and you couldn't communicate, everybody would be on top of it. If the social infrastructure is broken, that is also going to shape the quality of your experience in a community college. And it's incumbent upon leaders of community colleges to recognize when the social infrastructure is broken, or could be repaired, or can be maintained or revitalized. And I think it's in the interest of students and faculty and staff, everyone who spends time on a community college campus, to make the case that they could do better, to make the case that social infrastructure matters and might really determine the quality of an entire educational experience. So once you have the concept, I think you'll find you can do a lot of good work with it. And I wish you a great conference and great luck this year.